Late that night, after my husband beat me repeatedly for catching him cheating, I went to bed without a word. The next morning, when my husband woke up, he was immediately greeted by the aroma of his favorite slow-cooked beef brisket and smiled with satisfaction at the dining table, laden with a variety of dishes. He said, "It is good you finally understand and realize your mistake." But when he saw who was sitting at that table, his expression instantly changed. He became hysterical because before the story begins, please write in the comments section which region you are watching this story from. Do not forget to like and subscribe so this channel can grow and present even more interesting stories. That night, the rain fell in a torrent, as if the sky itself was weeping for the fate that had befallen Eleanor's marriage. The hands of the clock on the wall of the luxurious living room already pointed to 2 a.m. Yet, Eleanor remained seated upright on the cream-colored leather sofa. She was not watching television or reading a book, but simply staring at the tightly closed front door. In her hand, she clutched a smartphone whose screen was dark. However, within it lay enough proof to shatter her heart 1,000 times over. Photos of David, her husband, having a romantic dinner with another woman named Jessica had just been sent by a friend who happened to be at the same restaurant. Eleanor did not cry. Her tears felt as though they had dried up, for this was not the first time she had smelled the scent of betrayal on her husband. But tonight felt different. A cold determination was solidifying in her chest, a firm decision that she would no longer be the foolish woman who forgave for the sake of a hollow marriage. The sound of a car engine was faintly audible over the rain, followed by headlights piercing through the gaps in the curtains. David was home. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart, which beat not from love, but from a mixture of fear and disgust. The door swung open violently, revealing the figure of David, his shirt disheveled, his tie loosened, and a sharp stench of alcohol mixed with a cloying woman's perfume wafting from him. David was startled to see Eleanor still sitting in the living room with an unreadable expression. Instead of feeling guilty, David snorted in annoyance, as if his wife's presence was an intrusion on his peace after a day of pleasure. He tossed his briefcase aside and staggered towards the stairs without a word of greeting to Eleanor. Eleanor stood up slowly. Her voice was calm yet sharp as it cut through the silence of the night when she asked where her husband had been so late. That simple question apparently ignited the flames of anger in David, who was under the influence of alcohol and exhaustion. David spun around, his eyes red and blazing. He yelled that Eleanor had no right to control his life, for in his eyes she was just a wife whose job was to stay at home and enjoy the allowance he gave her. Eleanor did not back down. She stepped forward and showed him her lit phone screen, displaying the photo of David kissing Jessica's cheek. Eleanor asked who that woman was and why David could be so cruel to her, who had always strived to be an obedient wife. Seeing the proof, David's face turned crimson, not from shame, but because his ego was wounded. He felt his pride had been trampled because he had been caught. Without warning, a hard slap landed on Eleanor's left cheek. It was so forceful that her slender body staggered and fell against a decorative table. The sound of a shattering vase mingled with the clap of thunder outside. Eleanor held her cheek, which felt hot and stung. The corner of her lip was torn, bleeding fresh blood. But David was not finished. He grabbed Eleanor by the hair, pulling her face up to meet his eyes, and began to curse her with vulgar words unfit for a husband to speak. David blamed Eleanor for his affair. He shouted that he sought other women because Eleanor was boring, too rigid, and could not satisfy his masculine ego. Blow after blow landed on Eleanor's body that night. David vented all his frustration, his guilt twisted into rage and a sense of superiority. He punched her arms, kicked her legs, and pushed her until she was cornered against the wall. Eleanor felt an excruciating pain throughout her body. Her ribs ached with every breath she took, and her head was spinning. Yet, in the midst of that violent storm, one thing made David pause. Eleanor did not scream. Eleanor did not cry hysterically, begging for mercy as she usually did. Eleanor did not fight back or curse him in return. The woman was just silent. She received every blow with her eyes wide open, staring at David with a gaze that was empty, cold, and lifeless. Eleanor's silence made David uncomfortable, but then his arrogance took over. He interpreted her silence as a form of fear and total submission. David felt he had successfully subdued his wife, teaching her a lesson so she would never dare to defy him or bring up Jessica again. After satisfying his rage, David released his grip, letting Eleanor slump to the cold floor among the shards of the broken vase. David spat to the side, tidied his messy hair, and said with a dismissive tone that this was the consequence when a wife dared to be disrespectful to her husband. He ordered Eleanor to clean up the mess in the morning and not to dare complain to anyone if she did not want something worse to happen. David strode up to the master bedroom, leaving Eleanor still sitting on the living room floor. After the sound of the upstairs bedroom door slamming shut, the room fell silent again, with only the sound of the increasingly heavy rain. Eleanor slowly moved her battered body. She winced in pain as she tried to stand. Her hand trembled as she wiped the blood from the corner of her lip with the sleeve of her dress. She did not clean up the broken vase. She left it scattered as a silent witness to the night's cruelty. With a limp, she walked to the downstairs guest room, not to sleep, but to formulate her final plan. Inside the dark guest room, Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed. She did not turn on the light. Occasional flashes of lightning illuminated her bruised and swollen face. She reached into the pocket of her torn dress and pulled out her phone, its screen cracked but still functional. Her trembling fingers typed out a short message and sent a video file. The file was from a small security camera, disguised as a desk clock that she had installed in the living room a week ago. Her instincts had warned her of a confrontation like this, and the camera had recorded everything: David's furious face, every punch, and every curse. Eleanor looked at her phone screen, which showed the message as sent. She then touched the bruises on her face, feeling the real pain, but her heart felt strangely relieved. That night, Eleanor did not sleep. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to David's footsteps pacing upstairs before they finally fell silent, indicating the man had passed out from his drunken state. Eleanor pictured the faces of her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Wallace. She pictured the face of her brother, Ryan. All this time, Eleanor had hidden the shame of her marriage, not wanting to worry them, as she was raised to be a patient wife who covered her husband's faults. But tonight, that limit of patience had been shattered, along with her trampled dignity. Eleanor rose from the bed as the clock struck 4 a.m. Her body ached, but her mind was remarkably clear. She went to the kitchen, not to make breakfast out of love, but to prepare the stage for David's final act. She began to slice meat, mix spices for the brisket, and cook calmly as if nothing had happened. Inside her head, however, she was counting down the moments to her husband's destruction. The morning sunlight pierced through the blinds of the master bedroom, blinding David's still heavy eyes. He groaned softly, feeling a piercing headache from drinking too much the night before. But beneath the dizziness, his sense of smell caught a very familiar and appetizing aroma. The scent of beef, slow cooking for hours, mixed with robust spices like garlic, onion, and herbs. It was the smell of brisket, his favorite meal, which Eleanor only made on special occasions. Instantly, memories of last night's events replayed in his head. He remembered his anger, the blows he had dealt, and how Eleanor had remained silent, not fighting back. A faint smile touched David's lips. He felt proud of himself. His narcissistic mind concluded that his actions last night were a great success in disciplining his wife. In David's twisted logic, the brisket cooking this morning was a sign of apology from Eleanor. He was sure Eleanor was cooking his favorite food as a way to make peace, as a signal that she accepted her position as an obedient wife and would no longer question him about Jessica. David got out of bed, stretched his stiff muscles, and walked to the bathroom feeling like a victor. He imagined Eleanor downstairs, perhaps with a bruised face, setting the table fearfully, waiting for his command. After showering and putting on casual yet neat clothes, David left the room. He whistled softly as he descended the marble staircase of their luxurious home. The house was quiet. There were no clinking dishes or footsteps. Only the aroma of the brisket grew stronger, tempting his hungry stomach. As his feet touched the ground floor, he saw that the broken vase from last night was gone. The floor was sparkling clean. David nodded in satisfaction, praising how quickly Eleanor had learned to clean up a mess without being told twice. He walked towards the dining room, which was set back from the living room, separated by an artistic partition. David entered the dining area with a confident stride, adjusting the collar of his polo shirt. His eyes immediately fell upon the large mahogany dining table, which was set impeccably. In the center of the table, a large platter of beef brisket, still steaming, was the star, surrounded by warm cornbread, macaroni and cheese, and crispy onion strings. It was all of David's favorite food. His stomach rumbled loudly. He smiled broadly, feeling treated like a king who had just won a war. Without looking around carefully, he pulled out his usual chair at the head of the table. But his movement stopped. The chair was already occupied. The smile on David's face vanished instantly, replaced by a confused frown that slowly morphed into pure terror. His heart seemed to stop as his eyes fully processed the scene before him. In the head chair where he usually sat and commanded, sat Mr. Wallace, Eleanor's father. The middle-aged man, usually friendly, now stared at David with a gaze so sharp it felt lethal. His hands were clenched into tight fists on the table, his knuckles white. An aura of authority and restrained fury radiated from Mr. Wallace, making David's courage shrink instantly. David swallowed a bitter lump in his throat. His eyes shifted to Mr. Wallace's side. There sat Mrs. Wallace, his mother-in-law. The woman who usually greeted David with a warm hug now turned her face away. Her eyes were swollen and red from crying. There was a deep line of disappointment etched on her aged face. Mrs. Wallace could not bear to look at David, as if the sight of him was repulsive and painful to her eyes. Behind Mr. Wallace's chair stood Ryan, Eleanor's older brother. Ryan's athletic frame was tense, his jaw clenched, and his eyes conveyed a strong desire to leap across the table and beat David to a pulp, held back only by etiquette and the law. David took a step back, his legs feeling like jelly. He tried to open his mouth to greet them, but his voice was stuck in his throat. Mr. Wallace, Mrs. Wallace, Ryan, what a surprise to see you here so early, he managed to stammer, his voice trembling. He looked around for Eleanor, hoping his wife would emerge from the kitchen with drinks and break the icy tension. "Eleanor! Where is Eleanor?" he called out in a panic, his eyes darting around the room. But Eleanor was not there. Instead of Eleanor, David's gaze caught sight of other figures standing in the corner of the room, near the doors to the kitchen and the exit. There stood Mr. Peterson, the Wallace family's lawyer, known for being tough and unbeatable in court. Mr. Peterson was holding a tablet and a thick file, his face a stoic mask. And what made David's blood run cold was the presence of two uniformed police officers standing sternly beside Mr. Peterson. Their hands were poised on their belts, watching David with the probing gaze of law enforcement observing a criminal. The silence in the dining room was suffocating. Only the ticking of the wall clock could be heard. The aroma of brisket, which had been so tantalizing moments ago, now made David's stomach churn with nausea. Mr. Wallace slowly pushed the plate of brisket in front of him towards David, who was still standing frozen. The sound of the ceramic plate scraping against the wooden table was loud and grating. "Eat, mister," Wallace commanded. His voice was deep, low, and carried a real threat. There was no trace of friendliness. David was speechless, a cold sweat breaking out on his temples. "Sir, what is going on? I do not understand." "I said eat," Mr. Wallace barked. His voice thundered through the room, making Mrs. Wallace jump and start sobbing quietly again. Mr. Wallace pointed at the brisket with a finger trembling with rage. "Eleanor cooked this before dawn. She cooked this with a bruised face, a split lip, and a broken heart because of you. She cooked this as a final offering for you, David. Eat it, because this is the last decent meal that will touch your tongue before you rot in a prison cell." David shook his head in panic, his face ashen. "Prison? What do you mean? This must be a misunderstanding. Eleanor and I just had a typical fight. It is a marital problem. Where is Eleanor? Let me talk to her." David tried to step forward, but Ryan quickly slammed his fist on the table, making the plates rattle. "Do not say my sister's name with your filthy mouth," Ryan snarled, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You think we do not know? You think just because my sister has been silent all this time, you can treat her like an animal? We have seen everything, David. Everything." Mr. Peterson, the lawyer, stepped forward calmly. He placed the tablet he was holding on the table, facing David. On the screen, the security camera footage from last night was playing. The video clearly showed, in high resolution, how David slapped Eleanor to the ground, how he grabbed her by the hair, and how he beat her mercilessly. David's curses and the sounds of the impacts were clearly audible from the tablet speakers, filling the dining room with undeniable proof of his sin. Mrs. Wallace covered her ears, unable to listen to her daughter's suffering, while Mr. Wallace stared at David with a look of judgment. "This is not a marital dispute, Mr. David, Mr. Peterson said in a formal, cold tone. "This is felony assault and domestic violence. Based on the medical examination we had conducted on Mrs. Eleanor this morning, along with this video evidence, we have more than enough to drag you to court and ensure you receive the maximum sentence." One of the police officers stepped forward, pulling out a pair of shiny metal handcuffs. The click of the handcuffs opening sounded like a death knell for David's comfortable life. David's legs finally gave out. He collapsed to the floor, staring blankly at the food-laden table. The brisket was still steaming, its aroma unchanged, but now it was mixed with the stench of his own future's destruction. He realized that Eleanor's silence last night was not a sign of submission, but the calm before the storm that had now drowned him. The ride to the police precinct felt like a never-ending nightmare for David. He sat squeezed in the back of the patrol car, his hands cuffed tightly, flanked by two stoic, burly officers. The wailing siren, cutting through the morning traffic, seemed to announce his downfall to the entire city. David stared out the window with a vacant expression, watching the tall buildings where he used to conduct business meetings flash by. Shame began to creep into his mind, imagining how the neighbors in his upscale community had gathered to watch as he was dragged out of his house like a common thief. David, the successful and respected young director, was now being treated as nothing more than a criminal. But beneath the shame, the arrogance within him still flickered. He still believed that money and connections could solve anything. He thought this was just an emotional bluff from Eleanor's family. Upon arriving at the precinct, David was immediately led into a small, cold, and musty interrogation room. The room contained only a metal table and two rickety chairs. The flickering fluorescent light on the ceiling added to the grim atmosphere. David was shoved roughly into a chair. He tried to shout at the officer who uncuffed him, only to recuff him to the table, demanding his right to a phone call and more respectful treatment. But his shouts merely echoed off the cold concrete walls. No one listened. The officers left him alone in there for nearly 2 hours. The silence was deliberately crafted to break his spirit, making David anxious, angry, and finally, afraid. He started tapping on the table, his leg bouncing impatiently, and a cold sweat began to soak his now wrinkled, expensive shirt. The iron door of the room finally creaked open. Mr. Peterson, the family lawyer, walked in calmly, followed by a senior police detective. Mr. Peterson did not sit down. He stood across the table, looking down at David with a condescending gaze that made David's blood boil. David immediately spewed his anger, accusing Mr. Peterson and Eleanor's family of kidnapping and defamation. He insisted that what happened last night was just a normal husband-wife argument that should not involve outsiders, let alone the police. David even arrogantly offered a sum of money to close the case right then and there, assuming everyone's integrity could be bought. Mr. Peterson smiled faintly, a smile that did not reach his eyes. He opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick red folder. With a slow, deliberate motion, he spread out the photos from Eleanor's medical exam on the table, right in front of David's face. The photos were horrific. Eleanor's face was a mess of purple and blue bruises, her lip was split and stitched, and the contusions on her arms and back proved the violence was relentless. David turned his face away, unable to look at his own handiwork, but Mr. Peterson forced him to look. The lawyer explained in a flat voice that this medical report not only proved the physical violence from last night, but also uncovered a dark secret David had kept hidden. The detective then placed a lab report on top of the photos. David frowned, not understanding the connection between a blood test and an assault case. Mr. Peterson explained that after Eleanor was taken to safety early that morning, doctors conducted a thorough examination because she had been complaining of dizziness and weakness for several months. The lab results were shocking. Traces of a low-dose sedative, a benzodiazepine, were found in Eleanor's blood, the same substance found in the bottle of vitamins David had been giving his wife every night. David's face, once red with anger, turned deathly pale. His secret was out. For the past 6 months, David had been secretly mixing sedatives into Eleanor's drinks or vitamins to make her fall asleep quickly so she would not question him when he came home late or went to see Jessica. He thought his actions were clever, a subtle way to silence his wife without violence. But in the eyes of the law, it was a major felony. Mr. Peterson leaned forward, staring intently into David's eyes, and said that this was no longer just a domestic violence case. This was attempted murder and systematic poisoning of a spouse. David was at a loss for words, his tongue tied. He tried to deny it, claiming they were just regular vitamins, that the lab results must be wrong or fabricated, but his voice sounded weak and unconvincing even to himself. The fact that Eleanor knew and had stayed silent all this time sent a shiver down his spine. He realized her silence was not because the drug was working perfectly, but because she was gathering evidence to trap him. David realized he had walked right into a trap he had dug for himself. The wife he had considered foolish and submissive was a far more intelligent and deadly opponent than he had ever imagined. The detective began to read out the charges he would face. The potential sentence was no longer a matter of months, but decades in prison. The vision of a ruined career, a tarnished name, and life behind bars began to dance before his eyes. He slumped in his chair, his shoulders drooping, his arrogance shattered and replaced by real terror. He begged to speak with Eleanor, pleading with Mr. Peterson to convey his apologies. But Mr. Peterson simply packed his files back into his briefcase. Before leaving, Mr. Peterson said that Eleanor had no desire to hear another word from David's mouth, and the only communication between them from now on would be through a judge's gavel in a courtroom. The iron door slammed shut again, leaving David alone with the specter of his own ruin. After hours of languishing in uncertainty, David was finally given the chance to make one phone call. His mind raced. He could not call his mother in his small hometown. The old woman would likely have a heart attack upon hearing the news. He could not call his work colleagues either, as that would be career suicide. The only name that came to mind was Jessica, his mistress, the woman who had always showered him with sweet words and promises of loyalty. David was sure Jessica would help him. Did they not love each other? Did Jessica not always say that David was her everything? With a trembling hand, David dialed Jessica's number from the precinct phone. The line rang a few times before it was answered. Jessica's sultry voice greeted him, asking why he was calling from an unknown number. David, trying to keep his voice calm, explained that he was in a bit of trouble with the police because of a report Eleanor had filed. He lied, downplaying the issue as a small misunderstanding and saying he needed bail money to get out temporarily. David promised to pay her back double once he could access his bank accounts. Hearing the words "pay you back double," Jessica's tone immediately became enthusiastic. She agreed to come with her savings, thinking it was a small investment to win David's heart and fortune completely. 2 hours later, Jessica arrived in a glamorous style that was out of place, wearing large sunglasses and carrying a designer bag, striding into the police station as if it were a shopping mall. After a convoluted administrative process and a sizable bail payment, David was finally released on bail, his status now out on bond. He had to report weekly and was not allowed to leave the city. Stepping out of the police station and breathing in the free air, David felt an immense relief. He wrapped an arm around Jessica's waist, thanking her profusely, and said he would soon deal with Eleanor and divorce her so they could live happily ever since. Jessica smiled broadly, imagining herself soon becoming Mrs. David, living in a luxurious mansion. However, the relief was short-lived. Mr. Peterson, who had been waiting in the lobby, approached them. Without any pleasantries, the lawyer handed a large brown envelope to David. David accepted it with a frown. Mr. Peterson explained that it was a notice of asset seizure and property ownership status. David laughed dismissively, saying Eleanor had no right to seize anything because the house and cars were bought with his hard-earned money. But Mr. Peterson calmly dismantled his argument. He reminded David to reread the prenuptial agreement he had signed without reading carefully, too eager at the time to marry Eleanor, who came from a wealthy family. The document clearly stated that the luxurious house they lived in was an inheritance from Mr. Wallace, transferred to Eleanor's name before the marriage. Thus, it was not marital property. The luxury cars David drove daily were also purchased using funds from Eleanor's family business account, legally classified as company assets that could be recalled at any time. David fell silent, his eyes wide as he read the legal documents. He finally realized that all this time he had been a passenger in a lavish life facilitated by his wife. David's own large salary had been spent on his lifestyle, online gambling, and spoiling Jessica, leaving him with almost no personal assets of value. Mr. Peterson then delivered another piece of news that made David's knees weak. David's credit cards and bank accounts had been frozen by the bank due to a report of suspected corporate embezzlement filed by Mr. Wallace that morning. An internal audit had apparently been running silently for the past month. So at that moment, David had absolutely no money except for the cash in his wallet. Mr. Peterson left them in the parking lot with a satisfied smirk, letting the harsh reality sink into David's mind. Jessica, who had overheard the conversation, began to pull her arm away from David's waist. Her face showed signs of doubt. Panicked by her change in attitude, David tried to convince her that the lawyer was just bluffing. He insisted on taking her to their luxurious home to prove he was still in charge. They took an Uber, as David's car had been seized by the police as evidence. Throughout the ride, David continued to brag about his business plans and how he would destroy Eleanor's family in retaliation. Jessica remained silent, busy with her phone, perhaps calculating the pros and cons of her relationship with the man beside her. Upon arriving at the gate of the elite residential complex, their Uber was stopped by security. David got out angrily, yelling at the guard he had known for years to open the gate. But the guard looked at him coldly and said he had received direct orders from the homeowner, Mrs. Eleanor, to forbid David from entering. The gate lock had been replaced with a new digital system. David went berserk. He shook the tall iron gate like a madman, screaming Eleanor's name. Neighbors began to come out of their houses to watch the free spectacle with looks of contempt. The peak of David's mental breakdown occurred when the guard pointed to a black pile next to the security post. There, inside a large metal drum, were the smoldering remains of a fire. David ran closer and saw pieces of his expensive Armani suits, melted Italian leather shoes, and his collection of watches, all destroyed by the flames. All of David's personal belongings, the symbols of his status and pride, had been burned to ashes by Eleanor's orders. Nothing was left. He had no change of clothes, no home to return to, and no assets to boast about. David turned to look at Jessica, hoping for sympathy. But Jessica was staring at the pile of ashes in horror, then looked at David with a completely new expression. The look of a woman who realized the man before her was no longer a gold mine, but a disgusting liability. Jessica backed away slowly, shaking her head as David tried to reach for her hand. In front of the gate of the house he once proudly called his castle, David stood abandoned as the afternoon sky began to darken, signaling the beginning of the bleak future that awaited him. The gray twilight sky seemed to laugh at David's fate as he stood stranded in front of the gate of his own luxurious home. The evening wind blew hard, scattering the last of the ashes from the pile of his burned, expensive clothes. David stared blankly at the magnificent house, a place where he had once felt like a king, now sealed shut to him. He turned to the side, looking at Jessica, who stood with a sour face, clutching her designer bag tightly, as if afraid it too would catch fire. David attempted a smile, a pathetic effort to mask the panic that was beginning to erode his sanity. In a falsely optimistic tone, he suggested they leave. David said this was just a temporary setback, and they could start a new life in Jessica's apartment for a while until he could hire a top lawyer to reclaim his rights. He assured Jessica that Eleanor would not win in the end. They left the elite residential complex on foot, walking a considerable distance before finally hailing a taxi on the main road. Throughout the journey to Jessica's apartment, the atmosphere inside the taxi was cold and awkward. David kept talking, rambling about his plans for revenge, about how he would crush Eleanor's family business, and how he would make them all kneel and beg for his forgiveness. He was trying to convince himself and Jessica that he still had power, but Jessica was silent. She stared out the window with a vacant expression, her fingers tapping impatiently on her phone screen. There were no more sweet words, no more soothing touches. There was only a wall of ice slowly thickening between them. David tried to take Jessica's hand, but she gently pulled it away, saying it was sticky and sweaty. David swallowed his disappointment, thinking Jessica was probably just in shock from seeing the fire. Upon arriving at the apartment lobby, a place whose annual rent David had paid in full with last year's bonus, Jessica walked quickly ahead of David towards the elevator. David followed behind like a lost puppy. His clothes were wrinkled and smelled of stale sweat from the police station. When the apartment door opened, Jessica did not invite David in warmly as she usually did. She tossed her keys onto a table and sat down on the sofa, crossing her legs arrogantly. David entered hesitantly, closing the door quietly, and tried to sit next to her. But before he could, Jessica held up her hand, signaling for him to stop. Jessica's eyes, usually full of adoration, were now cold, calculating, and sharp. In a flat, emotionless voice, she asked to confirm one thing. She asked if it was true that all the assets, the house, the cars, and the bank accounts that David had been showing off were actually Eleanor's or had been frozen in Eleanor's name. David paused for a moment, then nodded slowly, trying to explain it was just a legal technicality that could be resolved. He said he still had a large salary and his director position at the company, so money would not be an issue. But that was not the answer Jessica wanted to hear. She let out a harsh snort, a cynical laugh escaping her brightly lipsticked lips. Jessica stood up, looking David up and down with a condescending gaze that shattered his pride into a million pieces. Jessica began to unload what had been on her mind, hidden behind a sweet facade. She said she was with David because he was a successful figure who could take her shopping for luxury goods, dine at five-star restaurants, and give her the lifestyle she dreamed of. She was not interested in a broke, middle-aged man with a criminal record who had been kicked out of his own house like a stray cat. The words were like sharp daggers slicing through David's heart. He stood agape, unable to believe what he was hearing. He tried to remind Jessica of their love, of the sweet promises of forever they had often whispered in bed. David knelt at Jessica's feet, begging for understanding, saying he needed her support now more than ever. But David's crocodile tears had no effect on Jessica. She was disgusted. She gently kicked his shoulder to push him away. Jessica screamed that she was not a charity for the homeless. She reminded David that the rent for this apartment was due next month, and without funds from him, she would have to find a new sponsor quickly. David's presence there would only hinder her chances of landing another rich man. Cruelly, Jessica grabbed David's remaining possessions, his wallet and phone, and threw them towards the door. She ordered him to leave that instant before she called security and reported him as a trespasser disturbing the residence. David got up, his body trembling. His eyes burned with unshed tears, a mixture of heartbreak and unvented rage. He looked at Jessica's face one last time, searching for any trace of the woman he once considered an angel, but all he found was a greedy monster. As the saying goes, when the money flows, the love shows. When the money goes, out the door he goes. David walked out of the apartment, his steps heavy. The door slammed shut right behind him, followed by the sound of the deadbolt turning twice. David stood in the quiet apartment hallway, alone, without a home, without money, and now without the love he had been so proud of. He realized how foolish he had been to sacrifice a diamond like Eleanor for a sharp-edged pebble like Jessica, who had now wounded him so deeply. That night, David spent his time at a secluded bench at a 24-hour truck stop not far from Jessica's apartment. He could not sleep well because of the cold and the hard bench, but the gnawing hunger in his stomach was far more tormenting. He only had a little cash in his wallet. He bought a cheap sandwich and a bottle of water, eating them ravenously while lamenting his fate. But in the midst of his despair, a false glimmer of hope appeared. He remembered his job title. Yes, his career. He was a successful marketing director. The company would not fire him over a personal issue. Tomorrow morning, he would go to the office, explain everything to the CEO, and request a company loan. With this renewed but fragile confidence, he tried to close his eyes, waiting for the morning to salvage what was left of his dignity. The morning sun, which usually brought energy, now felt scorching on David's sticky, unwashed skin. He tried to tidy his appearance in the truck stop's public restroom, splashing water on his face and combing his hair with his fingers. His shirt was severely wrinkled with a dirt stain on the sleeve, but he tried to straighten his shoulders, putting on the mask of authority he used to wear. He used his last few dollars to take an Uber to the skyscraper in the city's business district, where he had worked for the last 10 years, building a reputation as a brilliant young executive. Arriving at the magnificent lobby with its polished marble floors, David walked in confidently. He expected the security guards to greet him respectfully as usual, holding the door for him and asking how he was. But the opposite happened. The two guards on duty at the front door whispered to each other as they saw David approach. Their expressions were a strange mix of disgust and pity. They did not open the door, letting David push the heavy glass door open himself. David ignored it, assuming they were just being lazy. He walked to the security turnstiles and scanned his employee ID card. The indicator light on the machine flashed red, followed by a long beep indicating access was denied. David frowned, trying to scan his card again and again. The result was the same. Access denied. The line of employees behind him started to grow. Whispers became a low roar. David turned and saw dozens of pairs of eyes on him, not with admiration as before, but with contempt. A few female employees were covering their mouths while whispering to their friends, pointing at David. David's ears started ringing. He heard snippets of phrases like, "That is him," "the wife-beater," and "so shameless." His heart pounded. The news had spread faster than a virus. An HR manager named Robert, who used to be David's subordinate, came out of the elevator and approached him. Robert's face was flat and formal, with none of the friendly smiles he used to give. Without shaking David's hand, Robert asked him to follow him to a special room on the ground floor, not to his office on the top floor. David tried to protest, asking why his access was blocked. But Robert simply replied that it was standard procedure for employees in the process of termination. The word termination hit David like a sledgehammer. He followed Robert with weak legs, passing the judgmental stares of the receptionists and lobby staff. Inside the small room, the company's CEO, Mr. Davis, was already seated. The old man, usually fatherly, now looked at David with eyes full of suppressed anger. On the table lay a tablet displaying the viral video of David's assault on Eleanor. The video had apparently spread widely on social media overnight, uploaded by an anonymous account and becoming a national trending topic. The company's reputation was at stake as netizens began to attack the company's social media accounts, demanding David's termination. Mr. Davis did not beat around the bush. He slid a termination letter across the table to David. David tried to defend himself. He pleaded, saying it was a personal matter, unrelated to his performance at work. He reminded Mr. Davis of the sales targets he had surpassed last month, of the profits he had brought to the company. But Mr. Davis slammed his hand on the table, stopping David's rambling. Mr. Davis said that integrity was everything in this business. A man who could beat his own wife black and blue was not fit to lead a team and was not worthy of representing the company. Furthermore, Mr. Davis revealed a fact that made David freeze. The largest investor who had recently injected fresh funds into the company last month was a business consortium led by Mr. Wallace, Eleanor's father. That morning, Mr. Wallace's representative had called directly, threatening to pull all investments if David was still employed there for even one more second. Mr. Davis had no choice but to let David go to save hundreds of other employees. David was stunned. He finally understood the vast and powerful network of his wife's family, which he had always underestimated. He was not just fighting Eleanor, he was fighting a giant who could crush him with a snap of its fingers. Mr. Davis added that David was being fired for cause, meaning he would not receive any severance pay. Moreover, because the case involved criminal acts and a severe breach of ethics, David's name would be blacklisted by the industry association. This meant no reputable company in the field would ever hire him. The career David had built with blood and sweat for 10 years vanished in an instant, utterly destroyed. 2 large security guards entered the room, ordered to escort David out of the building immediately. David tried to ask for permission to retrieve his personal belongings from his desk photos, awards, and important documents, but Robert informed him that all his personal items had already been packed into a cardboard box and left with the security guard outside. He was strictly forbidden from setting foot on the office floors. David was escorted out like a prisoner, passing through the now even more crowded lobby. It felt like walking down a corridor of hell. Everyone stared at him. Some were recording with their phones, some were openly sneering. David reached the outside of the building, the afternoon sun burning his skin. The security guard handed him a used noodle box containing his belongings. David took the box with trembling hands. He stood on the hot sidewalk, surrounded by the hustle and bustle of the busy city. People passed by, each with their own business. No one cared about a disheveled man who had just lost everything. David looked up at the tall building one last time, the building that was once a symbol of his success. He now realized he was truly alone in a cruel world. No home, no wife, no lover, no money, and now, no job. Regret began to seep in. But it was too late, far too late. The day of the first mediation hearing arrived, a day that should have been a moment for reconciliation, but for David, it felt like Judgment Day. David sat in the family court's waiting room, his appearance pathetic. The shirt he wore was the only one left in his box of belongings, wrinkled and stained with sweat from days of wear. His face was covered in an unkempt beard, his eyes had dark, thick bags under them, and his body was gaunt from lack of food and severe stress. For the past few days, David had been sleeping in different places, from bus stations to park benches, avoiding debt collectors and the scornful looks of people who recognized him from the viral video. He felt small, ashamed, and broken. Yet, in the darkest corner of his heart, a foolish glimmer of hope remained. He thought that if he begged earnestly, if he showed how much he was suffering now, Eleanor would surely soften. The Eleanor he knew was a gentle woman who could not bear to see a stray cat go hungry, let alone her own husband suffer. The mediation room door opened. David turned quickly, his heart pounding. The plaintiff's party entered. Mr. Peterson walked in front with a confident stride, followed by two legal assistants. But David's eyes were not on them. His gaze was fixed on the woman walking in their midst, protected. It was Eleanor. David barely recognized her. The Eleanor who used to look weary in simple house dresses was now radiant. Eleanor wore an elegant nude-colored blazer and skirt suit, paired with a soft, patterned silk scarf that framed her face perfectly. The bruises on her face had faded, covered by light makeup that highlighted the beauty that had been hidden under the shadow of his dominance. There was no longer fear or hesitation in her eyes. Eleanor walked with her chin held high, radiating an intimidating aura of confidence and calm. As they sat across from each other at the mediation table, David felt like a speck of dust before a diamond. The mediator began the session by asking if there was any possibility of reconciliation. Before Mr. Peterson could answer, David cut in. He threw himself from his chair, kneeling on the cold floor before Eleanor. He wept, tears that were part genuine despair and part performance. David began to ramble, using the sweet words he once used to manipulate Eleanor. He said he had lost his way. He said he was bewitched by Jessica and swore he would change and become a better husband. He pleaded for Eleanor to see his current broken state as proof that he had received his karma and suffered enough. He tried to reach for the hem of her skirt, hoping a physical touch would awaken old memories, but Eleanor's reaction was completely beyond David's expectations. She did not pull her leg away in disgust, nor did she weep with emotion. Eleanor simply looked down at the prostrating David with a flat expression, as if looking at an insignificant stranger. Slowly, Eleanor spoke. Her voice was calm, low, but every syllable was clear and pierced him to the bone. Eleanor said that David did not need to bother with the theatrics. She said that the David she once loved, the husband she was proud of, had died the moment the first blow landed on her face that night. The figure before her now was just an empty shell, a coward who only remembered God and his wife when his wealth and position were gone. Eleanor stated firmly that there was not a single shred of love left in her heart. All that remained was gratitude, that God had opened her eyes before it was too late. David fell silent, looking up at his wife's face. He saw no anger there. What was more painful was that he saw total indifference. It was the look of someone who had truly moved on. Eleanor then signaled to Mr. Peterson. The lawyer took out a thick document and placed it in front of David. Eleanor explained coldly that it was additional evidence she would be taking to the criminal courts for fraud and embezzlement. The document contained transaction records from the family company account that David managed. It turned out that for the past 2 years, David had been falsifying receipts and inflating budgets, then transferring the difference to Jessica's personal account. The total amount was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. David's eyes widened, a cold sweat pouring down his face. He thought he had covered his tracks perfectly. Eleanor smiled faintly, a deadly smile. She said she had been silent, not because she did not know, but because she was waiting for the amount to be large enough to ensure David would rot in prison for a very long time. The money he stole to spoil his mistress was money meant for orphans managed by the Wallace Family Foundation. David had stolen from the most sacred of places. Eleanor concluded the conversation by saying she did not need David's apology. She only needed justice. She stood up, straightened her blazer, and walked out of the room without a single backward glance, leaving David still kneeling, his mouth agape, realizing that the legal noose around his neck was now tighter and more suffocating than ever. After the failed mediation and the looming threat of more prison time, David felt his world had truly ended. But his survival instinct still flickered. He remembered one person who would surely never abandon him, no matter how terrible his sins: his own mother. The old woman living in a small town in Ohio had always spoiled him, always defended him, even when he was wrong as a child. David was sure a mother's prayer and testimony could turn things around, or at least lessen his sentence. With the last of the change he found on the street, David called his mother from a payphone. He sobbed uncontrollably, twisting the facts. He said he was being framed by Eleanor's wealthy family. He said he was a victim and begged his mother to come to the city to be a character witness at his trial. He needed her to tell the judge that David was a good, pious son who could never commit violence. His mother, on the other end of the line, sounded shocked and cried hysterically upon hearing her son's fate. The old woman's frail voice gave David a sliver of relief. He felt he had secured his support. His mother promised to come. She said she would sell her only valuable possession, a small piece of land, for the bus ticket to the city to defend her pride and joy. David hung up feeling a little calmer. He thought that at least in the courtroom, he would not be alone. The presence of an old, frail mother would surely evoke the judge's sympathy and make Eleanor look evil for causing hardship to her own mother-in-law. It was the last cunning strategy left in David's mind. The day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was packed. The case had become a local media sensation, involving a prominent business family and a scandalous affair. David sat in the defendant's chair, wearing a prisoner's orange jumpsuit. He kept his head down, trying to avoid the flashes of reporters' cameras, but his eyes kept darting to the entrance, waiting for his mother's arrival. And sure enough, the door soon opened. His mother entered with a faltering step, wearing a worn-out dress and a simple headscarf. David's heart leaped with joy. He smiled broadly at his mother, ready to receive a warm, defensive hug. But something was strange. His mother did not walk towards the visitors' gallery behind David. She was guided by a court officer towards the witness stand. And even more shockingly, she was accompanied by Ryan, Eleanor's brother. David frowned, confused. Why was his mother with the opposing side? Perhaps Ryan was just helping an elderly woman, he thought optimistically. The judge then asked his mother if she was ready to testify. She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. David looked at his mother expectantly, giving her a coded glance to start telling everyone how good he was. The judge asked, "Ma'am, is it true that the defendant, David, is a dutiful and responsible son, as he claims in his defense?" A tense silence filled the room. His mother bowed her head, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Then slowly, she raised her face and looked at David. It was not a look of affection, but one of deep hurt, disappointment, and pent-up anger. With a hoarse but loud voice, she answered, "No, Your Honor. My son, David, He is not a dutiful son. He is a disgraceful son who has been slowly killing his mother while she is still alive. David was jolted as if struck by lightning. "Mom, what are you talking about?" he shouted in panic. But the judge immediately banged the gavel, ordering him to be silent. His mother continued her testimony with a trembling voice. She opened a worn cloth bundle she had brought. Inside was an old, tattered savings passbook. She told the court that for 10 years she had saved bit by bit from selling vegetables at the farmer's market, collecting every penny for a trip to the Holy Land, her lifelong dream before she died. 2 years ago, David came home, crying that he needed urgent capital for a business or he would go bankrupt. Out of pity, she gave David her entire life savings. David promised to return it in 6 months. But it turned out, her sobs grew louder, silencing the entire courtroom, that the money was not used for business. My neighbor, whose son works in the city, saw David on vacation in Hawaii with another woman. That woman was not Eleanor. He used his mother's sacred money for adultery. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged the gavel repeatedly to restore order. David was frozen in his chair, his face ashen. He never thought his mother knew about that. He thought she was a simple country woman who was easy to fool. His mother stared sharply at David, her tears still flowing, but her gaze grew harder. "I gave birth to him. I nursed him, but I failed to raise him right," she continued, her voice filled with a heart-wrenching sorrow. "I am ashamed, Your Honor. I am ashamed to have a son who beats a wife as good as Eleanor. I am ashamed to have a son who steals from his own mother. I did not come here to defend him. I came to see him punished. Let the prison teach him, because I no longer can." Those words were the final nail in the coffin of David's life. His own mother, the one person he had hoped would be his protector, now stood as his most damning accuser. Mrs. Wallace, sitting in the gallery, was seen comforting David's mother, who nearly fainted after giving her testimony, a touching scene of solidarity between mothers that moved everyone except David. David felt his chest tighten, the oxygen seemingly vanishing from the room. He was betrayed by his own greed, and now by his own flesh and blood. He watched as Ryan helped his mother turn her face away, refusing to look at David anymore. That day, David not only lost his freedom, he lost his status as a son. He was an orphan in the saddest sense of the word, cast out by his own mother for behavior that had crossed the line of humanity. The atmosphere in the courtroom that day was dense and suffocating, as if the air itself refused to flow amidst the escalating tension. This was the final day of the trial, the day David's fate would be decided by the judge's gavel. David sat in the dock, his body even thinner, his face almost unrecognizable. His eyes were wild and fearful, constantly scanning the room, searching for any small escape from this bitter reality. But there was no way out. To his right, the prosecution team sat with a mountain of evidence. To his left, the public defender appointed to him looked resigned and unenthusiastic, knowing the case was a dead end for his client, who had already lost everything. The biggest shock of the day came when the prosecutor called the final, damning witness. The courtroom door opened, and in walked Jessica. She walked with her head down, avoiding everyone's gazes, especially David's. Jessica's appearance was drastically different. There were no more fancy dresses or sparkling jewelry. She wore simple clothes and no makeup, trying to appear innocent before the law. David jumped in his seat, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had thought Jessica might still have some love left for him, or at least some solidarity. But that hope was shattered the moment Jessica began to speak into the microphone. To save herself from being prosecuted as an accomplice to embezzlement, Jessica had made a deal with the prosecutor to become a cooperating witness. Before the judge, Jessica shifted all the blame onto David. She testified through crocodile tears that David had forced her to accept the money. She claimed David was a manipulative man who had trapped her in an illicit affair with the promise of a false, lavish life. Jessica even recounted how David would often belittle Eleanor in front of her, calling his wife a foolish woman who was easy to deceive. Every word from Jessica's mouth was like a dagger in David's back. He screamed hysterically, calling Jessica a traitor and a liar, but his outburst only made him look worse and more unstable in the eyes of the judge. Security guards quickly restrained him, forcing him back into his seat. After all the witnesses had been heard and the evidence presented, it was time for the verdict. The presiding judge, a middle-aged man with thick glasses and a stern face, began to read the sentence, his voice echoing throughout the room. The judge declared that David was found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of felony domestic violence resulting in physical and psychological trauma, attempted poisoning, and large-scale corporate embezzlement. There were no mitigating factors for David's sentence. His uncooperative attitude, lack of genuine remorse, and even his exploitation of his own mother's savings were all aggravating factors. The judge took a deep breath before delivering the maximum sentence. David was sentenced to 15 years in prison, plus a fine of over $1 million. If the fine was not paid, his sentence would be extended, and any remaining assets would be seized by the state. The gavel struck 3 times with a loud bang that sounded like a death knell for David's future. The courtroom erupted. A wave of subdued applause came from the gallery, which was filled with Eleanor's relatives and women's rights activists who had been following the case. David went limp, his body slumping in the chair as if his bones had been removed. He wailed, calling out his mother's name, but his mother was not there. She had returned to her hometown, heartbroken, after her testimony last week. As the bailiffs began to drag David back to the holding cell, his gaze locked onto one point. In the front row, Eleanor stood up slowly. She was not clapping, nor was she smiling cynically. Her face was calm, peaceful, and filled with relief. She hugged Mr. and Mrs. Wallace, then politely shook the prosecutor's hand. Eleanor seemed to glow, so far out of David's reach, as if they were beings from different dimensions. David tried to scream Eleanor's name, hoping she would turn for just a second, hoping to see a flicker of some feeling in her eyes, but Eleanor did not turn around at all. She turned and walked out of the courtroom, surrounded by the people who loved her, leaving David to be dragged, still struggling, into the darkness of the prison corridor. That day, David finally realized that the harshest punishment was not the physical prison, but the reality that he had been completely erased from the lives of those who once genuinely loved him. He was now just a bad memory, a stain that had been successfully wiped clean. 5 years later, the scorching afternoon sun baked the asphalt of the capital city's congested and dusty streets. On the outskirts of the city, in a crowded, run-down neighborhood, stood a Greasy Spoon Diner, a small establishment whose walls were grimy with vehicle exhaust. In the back of the diner, near a foul-smelling gutter, a gaunt man with graying, unkempt hair was squatting, washing a pile of dirty dishes. That man was David. He had been released on parole a few months ago due to prison overcrowding, but freedom had not brought him a better life. With a long criminal record and a blacklisted name, no company would hire him, not even as a security guard. His assets were long gone, used to pay fines and restitution, and his family back home had completely cut ties. His mother had passed away a year after he was imprisoned, taking her disappointment to the grave without ever visiting him once. David now worked odd jobs, sometimes as a day laborer at the market, sometimes collecting cans, and now as a dishwasher at this diner for a wage of leftover food and cigarette money. His back often ached from years of sleeping on cold prison floors, and many of his teeth were missing from malnutrition. The hands that were once smooth from holding expensive pens and steering luxury cars were now calloused, cracked, and smelled of cheap dish soap. The diner's owner, a heavy-set and harsh woman, often yelled at him if he worked too slowly or broke a glass. The once proud and arrogant David could only bow his head in submission, his spirit crushed by the harsh turn of life's wheel. That afternoon, the diner was quiet. David took a short break, wiping the sweat from his forehead with his dirty sleeve. His eyes were drawn to the old tube television hanging in the corner. The news was broadcasting a special feature on the Inspirational Woman of the Year award. The screen showed a luxurious hotel ballroom filled with the light of crystal chandeliers. The camera then focused on a woman walking onto the stage to receive a trophy. David's heart seemed to stop. The plastic cup in his hand fell to the floor. The woman on the television screen was Eleanor. She looked much younger and more beautiful than 5 years ago. Her hair was styled elegantly, her smile radiant and full of confidence. The news narrator explained that Eleanor was now the owner of a successful catering and restaurant business with branches in major cities as well as the founder of a foundation that helps victims of domestic violence get back on their feet. Beside Eleanor stood a handsome man who looked at her with pride and love. He was Eleanor's new husband, a well-known philanthropic doctor. In the audience, Mr. and Mrs. Wallace could be seen clapping, holding a cute toddler, the child from Eleanor's second marriage. They were all laughing happily, a picture of a perfect, whole, and warm family. David was frozen, staring at the blurry screen. He saw the life that could have been his, if only he had not been greedy, if only he had not been unfaithful, if only he had been grateful. An overwhelming regret hit his chest with brutal force, making it hard to breathe. He remembered how Eleanor used to serve him faithfully, how she always looked at him with the same love that her new husband now did. David had thrown away a diamond to chase after trash, and now he was living in the trash heap itself. Tears welled up in the corners of his wrinkled eyes, streaming down his dirty cheeks. "Hey, stop daydreaming!" The diner owner's shout broke David's trance. The woman placed a tin plate on the table near where David was squatting. "Here is your lunch. Hurry up and finish it, then get back to the dishes. Customers are starting to come in." David looked at the plate. It was cold, leftover rice from yesterday with some greasy brisket gravy and a small, tough, and burnt piece of brisket. It was the scrapings from the bottom of the pot, usually thrown out or given to the cat, but today it was his lunch. David's hungry stomach growled painfully. He took the plate with trembling hands. The smell of the brisket, though stale and mixed with the scent of soap, instantly threw his memory back to that morning 5 years ago. He remembered that morning, the morning he woke up to the aroma of Eleanor's perfect brisket prime beef, tender and infused with spices, served on a luxurious dining table with love. The morning he arrogantly felt like he had won, that he could trample on the wife who had prepared such a delicious meal for him. At that time, he had rejected that heavenly food for the sake of his ego. And now, here, by a smelly gutter, he had to eat leftover brisket that tasted bitter just to stay alive. David shoveled the cold rice and gravy into his mouth. It tasted bland and pathetic. But every chew felt like a knife twisting in his heart. He ate while sobbing. His tears fell onto the plate, mixing with the gravy. He ate ravenously out of hunger, but also with an indescribable pain. He realized this was his true final breakfast. Not the lavish meal he had left on the dining table of his home, but the leftovers that symbolized the permanent ruin of his life. On the television, Eleanor waved as she finished her speech, met with thunderous applause. In the dark corner of the diner, David choked on his own tears, alone, humiliated, and forgotten. The screen slowly faded to black, leaving David with an empty plate and a regret that would never end. Karma had completed its task perfectly. Light rain drizzled against the windows of Eleanor's warm and brightly lit kitchen. A very familiar aroma once again filled the room, the scent of simmering broth mixed with robust spices. Eleanor was cooking brisket, but this time the atmosphere was completely different from 5 years ago. There were no bruises on her face, no chilling fear in her chest, and no vengeful plans churning in her mind. She stirred the large pot with a little hum on her lips, wearing a pretty pastel-colored apron. Today was her second wedding anniversary with her new husband, a pediatrician named Ryan, a kind man introduced to her by her family. In another corner of the city, dark and damp, Jessica huddled in the corner of her cramped studio apartment. The door was being banged on violently from the outside by the landlord, demanding 3 months of overdue rent. Jessica covered her ears, trembling in fear. The beauty she once flaunted as her capital to attract rich men had faded, worn down by stress and a poor lifestyle. Her face looked old beyond her years, with fine lines appearing at the corners of her sunken eyes. After the court case, Jessica's name was tarnished everywhere. No respectable man wanted to be near her, and she ended up as the mistress of a series of cruel and stingy men before being cast aside when she started to age. Jessica stared at the cracked mirror on her wardrobe, seeing the reflection of a pathetic woman who once felt victorious for stealing another woman's husband, now realizing she was just a trophy that had lost its value. Back at Eleanor's house, a pair of strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind. Eleanor smiled, leaning her head against her husband's shoulder. "Doctor." Ryan kissed his wife's cheek and praised the appetizing aroma of her cooking. There were no shouts, no curses, no demands. Only sincere appreciation. Eleanor turned off the stove and turned to face her husband. She remembered a fleeting image of the past, of the plate of brisket she had served David as a final farewell. Back then, the brisket was a symbol of her anger, of her wounded pride. But today, Eleanor had reclaimed the meaning of that dish. This brisket was no longer about David. This brisket was about love, about family, and about the future. That evening, they had dinner with Mr. and Mrs. Wallace, who had come to visit. Laughter filled the dining room. In the middle of the warm conversation, Eleanor glanced at the calendar on the wall. She paused for a moment. Today's date was the exact same date as the night of the assault 5 years ago. But what made Eleanor smile with relief was the fact that she had almost forgotten. She no longer marked this day as a day of mourning or trauma. The memory of David, of the beatings and the betrayal, had faded into a small stain in her past that no longer hurt. Eleanor realized that the best revenge was not seeing her enemy suffer, but living so happily that she forgot her enemy ever existed. Outside the gates of Eleanor's house, an old man collecting cans walked with a limp through the rain, shouldering a wet sack. He paused for a moment, smelling the aroma of brisket carried by the wind from the house's vent. His stomach rumbled, his mouth watered. The man, David, looked at the warm yellow light emanating from the dining room window. He could see the silhouette of a happy family inside. An excruciating pain pierced his heart, but he knew he was not worthy of even knocking on the gate. With a heavy heart, David lowered his head and walked away into the darkness of the night, carrying his eternal regret with him. Meanwhile, inside the house, Eleanor laughed freely, truly liberated and whole once more.